Imagine yourself in London in 1872, a city filled with smog and dust where gas lights illuminate the cobblestone streets and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoes through the night. Christmas that year brings not only presents and laughter, but also a dark secret that will shake British society. This is the story of a brutal murder, a mysterious young woman, and an investigation that has lasted more than 150 years and still leaves no answers. As we look into the Harriet Buzzwell case, we discover more than a simple crime, but a window into the complex world of Victorian society, a world where women fought to survive in the shadows, where reputation was more important than truth, and where justice could be clouded by social prejudice. This story takes you from the shadowy streets of Bloomsbury to the shores of Australia, from the glittering stage of the Alhambra to the solemn courtroom, and finally, to a shocking revelation that could change the way we understand this case forever. On December 25, 1872, while millions of London families were enjoying the warmth of Christmas, a horrifying discovery was made at 12 Great Coram Street, Bloomsbury. Landlady Harriet Wright stood with increasing anxiety at the door of a tenant's room. Harriet Buzzwell, a dancer at the Alhambra Theatre, had not appeared since returning late on Christmas Eve with a strange man. What is striking is the contrast between the festive atmosphere outside and the tragedy that awaited discovery inside that small room. While other families were gathered around the dinner table laughing and exchanging gifts, a brutal crime had occurred just hours earlier. This contrast not only adds to the drama of the case, but also reflects a grim reality of Victorian society. That behind the polite and orderly exterior, there was always an oak and violent side. When the door was finally broken open, the sight they saw was one that would shock even those who had witnessed tragedy. Harriet Buzzwell lay on the bed, bloodied, her throat slashed to the bone, and the marks of the killer's hand on her forehead. This was no ordinary murder, but a deliberate and calculated act of violence. The brutality of the wounds suggested that this was not a spontaneous crime, but the result of a premeditated plan. It is important to emphasize that this case took place in the context of Victorian society, where being a single woman living in a boarding house and working as a dancer was viewed with suspicion and prejudice. Harriet Buzzwell was not only a victim of crime, but also a victim of a society that was intolerant of women who did not conform to the strict social norms of the era. Harriet Buzzwell is not a name that appears in the great history books, but her story reflects a reality that existed widely in Victorian society. Born around 1845 in Wisbech, Cambridge, she came to London like many other young women with dreams of finding opportunity and success in the glamorous capital. However, the reality she faced was completely different from what she had expected. At the age of 27, Harriet became a dancer at the Alhambra Theatre in Leicester Square, where she performed under the stage names Clara Burton or Clara Bruton. The Alhambra Theatre was not only a place of entertainment during that period, but also a symbol of the luxury and glamour of Victorian London. With its sparkling chandeliers, red velvet curtains, and lively performances, it represented everything a young country girl could dream of. Behind the glamour of the stage, however, was a life of hardship and instability. Harriet was constantly faced with financial difficulties, having to borrow money from other tenants, and often falling behind on rent. This reflected the harsh reality of life for showgirls at the time. Although they might appear glamorous on the outside, their incomes were often unstable and insufficient to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. The most notable aspect of Harriet's life was that she had to support an 8-year-old daughter, Kate, born around 1864. In Victorian society, being a single woman raising a child was not only an economic challenge, but also a social burden. This was also one of the factors that pushed her into prostitution to supplement her income, a reality that society at that time did not want to acknowledge, but secretly existed. As we look at Harriet's life, we cannot help but feel sympathy for the struggles she faced. She was not a fallen woman in the moral sense that Victorian society often labeled her, but a mother trying her best to raise her children and survive in a society that was not friendly to single women. She was a prime example of thousands of other women struggling in the shadows of the big city, where opportunity and danger were always intertwined. To better understand the Harriet Buzzwell case, we need to place it in the context of Victorian society, with its rigid moral codes and clear social hierarchies. The Victorian era was characterized by the doctrine of separate spheres, whereby women were seen as the moral guardians of the family, and should operate only within the domestic sphere, while men were allowed to participate in the public world of business and politics. This doctrine created a clear line between respectable women and those who were considered fallen. Harriet Buzzwell, as a solo dancer and occasional prostitute, fell outside these lines and thus became the target of social stigma. This affected not only how she was treated while she was alive, but also how her case was investigated and how the public responded. Statistics show that there were about 8,600 officially recorded prostitutes in London at the time, but historians estimate that the real number could be as high as 80,000. This figure reflects the fact that for many working-class women, especially those in the entertainment industry, prostitution was not a moral choice, but an economic necessity. This was a core contradiction of Victorian society. On the one hand, it was strongly condemned as a social evil, while on the other, it was silently tolerated and even relied on. Bloomsbury, where Harriet lived, was a perfect example of London's complex social geography. Once a fashionable aristocratic area, by the 1870s, it had become a socially diverse area. Great Coram Street was lined with modest lodgings like number 12, where performers, office workers, and those of precarious circumstances could find lodging if they could afford the rent. It was also a place where social boundaries blurred, creating an environment conducive to both opportunity and crime. Understanding this social context helps us to realize that the Harriet Buzzwell case was not just an individual crime, but also the product of a social system that was riddled with contradictions and injustices. It highlights the issues of gender inequality, poverty, and social stigma that many women faced at the time. The night of 24th of December, 1802, can be reconstructed in detail, thanks to the testimony of witnesses, creating a clear picture of the final hours of Harriet Buzzwell's life. At about 10 a.m. that morning, after borrowing a shilling from another lodger, she left 12 Great Coram Street and headed for the Alhambra Theatre. The fact that she had to borrow money suggests that her financial situation was very difficult, a small but significant detail in understanding the motives of the case. At the Alhambra Theatre, amid the bustle of the performances and the glittering lights of the chandeliers, Harriet met a man described by witnesses as foreign-looking, with a distinct German accent. This meeting was not accidental, but may have been prearranged, adding to the mystery of the man's identity and motives. That evening, the two dined at Cavour Restaurant, where waiter William Stalker would later recall serving them. Witnesses described the pair as appearing relaxed and cheerful, with no signs of tension or conflict. This adds to the mystery of the motive for the murder, as it suggests that the crime may not have been the result of a sudden argument or conflict. After dinner, they took a bus from Piccadilly Circus back to Bloomsbury, accompanied by a waitress from the Alhambra Theatre, who would later become a key witness. Before returning to Great Coram Street, the pair stopped at George Fleck's grocery store to buy fruit and nuts, perhaps as simple snacks or more worryingly as food for a night that the German had decided would end in bloodshed. George Fleck's testimony is interesting. "I remember them very well. The girl was familiar to me as a customer. The man was a stranger German in his demeanor and speech. He looked cultured, even respectable. They bought apples and nuts, as cheerful as any couple at Christmas." This testimony not only provides information about the suspect's appearance, but also highlights the contrast between his normal, even respectable appearance and the brutal crimes he was about to commit. Around midnight, Harriet returned to the inn with the German man. Mrs. Wright, the landlady, was still awake and witnessed their arrival. Shortly afterwards, Harriet paid the outstanding rent of 9 shillings in half a sovereign, a transaction that would later raise questions about the motive for the robbery, as it suggested that the victim had money in her possession shortly before her death. Mrs. Wright later testified, "She looked cheerful. There was no sign of distress. The man was well dressed, looked respectable. I had no reason to be nervous. God help me, there was no reason." This testimony again emphasized the contrast between the seemingly normal appearance and the crime that was about to happen. What happened behind the closed door of Harriet Buzzwell's room in the hours that followed is lost to history. But at around 6:30 a.m. on Christmas Day, the German man was heard leaving the inn. By then, Harriet Buzzwell was dead. Her life ended in a brutal act of violence. The crime scene that investigators encountered on Christmas Day painted a picture of horror that contrasted sharply with the festive mood of the day. The bed, the Times later reported, was horrific in appearance, soaked in the victim's blood. Harriet's throat had been slashed with such violence that the blade had reached the bone, a wound that would later be horrifyingly compared to the Jack the Ripper murders of 16 years later. The police surgeon commented, "The violence of the attack suggests either great anger or calculated brutality." The marks of a hand on the victim's forehead indicate that she had been held down throughout the attack. Death came quickly, but was preceded by moments of an indescribable horror. This comment not only describes the brutal nature of the crime, but also suggests its premeditated nature. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence found at the scene was a bitten apple. In a remarkably advanced application of forensics for the era, investigators made casts of the teeth, noting that they did not match Harriet's. This primitive attempt at what would later be known as forensic dentistry provides a fascinating glimpse into the birth of modern criminal investigation, although it was of limited value at the time. Bloody towels and handkerchiefs scattered throughout the room may indicate an attempt to clean up the scene, or attempts by the killer to clean himself before leaving. The door had been locked from the outside, and the key had been taken away, a deliberate act that suggests preparation rather than a spontaneous crime. Several items appear to have been missing, including jewelry and a pawn ticket, which points to robbery. However, the fact that Harriet had enough money to pay her rent shortly before her death complicates this theory and deepens the mystery. This raises the question of the true motive for the crime. Was it robbery, or was there another more sinister motive? Analysis of the crime scene also revealed a contrast between the seemingly ordinary appearance of the room and the brutal nature of the crime. This was not a random attack, but a planned and brutal act. The attention to detail in locking the door and removing the key suggests that the killer had thought about how to conceal the crime and escape. Superintendent Thompson of the Metropolitan Police's E Division led the investigation, which quickly attracted public attention. The Times reported alleged murder in Great Coram Street on December 26th, just a day after the body was discovered. In an era without fingerprints, DNA analysis, or even basic forensics, the investigation relied heavily on witness testimony to identify the mysterious German man last seen with Harriet Buzzwell. Chief Inspector Thompson stated, "We are looking for a foreign-looking man speaking German, aged around 30, well-dressed and apparently educated. Anyone with information about the whereabouts of this individual on Christmas Eve is asked to get in touch." Such a specific description suggests that the police have a fairly clear picture of the suspect based on witness statements. A substantial reward of £200, equivalent to around £20,500 today, was offered for information leading to the arrest of the killer. This not only provided an incentive for witnesses, but also sparked controversy over their motives. The large sum reflected the importance the authorities placed on the case, but also created the possibility of witness testimony being falsified. The investigation produced a parade of witnesses, each contributing important details to the emerging picture of the final hours of Harriet and her mysterious companion. George Fleck, the grocer, remembered selling fruit to the couple. A waiter at the Cavour restaurant remembered serving them dinner. A waitress from the Alhambra Theater recalled riding on the bus with Harriet, and the German man and Mrs. Wright, the innkeeper, saw them return to the inn. Each description pointed to a man of foreign origin, well-dressed and speaking German, a description that would soon lead investigators to an unexpected suspect. The consistency in the testimonies created a clear picture of the suspect, but also raised questions about the possibility that all the witnesses may have been influenced by the large reward. Interestingly, this investigation took place during a transitional period in the history of criminal investigation. This was a time when forensic science was just beginning to develop, and the identification of criminals relied heavily on witness testimony and direct evidence. This limitation created significant challenges for investigators, but also makes the story more interesting from a historical perspective. In January 1873, the investigation led police to the German brick ship Wangeland, which was anchored at Ramsgate for repairs. The ship was carrying passengers and crew to Brazil, where they planned to establish a new German colony. Among the crew were two men who would become central to the investigation: Karl Vobe, the deputy surgeon, and Herr Gottfried Hessel, the ship's chaplain. The discovery of the ship was not accidental, but the result of a systematic investigation. The police monitored all ships leaving London in the days following the murder, paying particular attention to those with German passengers or crew. It is a typical example of the patient and meticulous investigative methods employed by the Victorian police in the absence of modern investigative tools. Inspector Harnett from London accompanied the witnesses to carry out an identification, a journey that reflected the seriousness with which the authorities were treating Harriet Buzzwell's murder. As he boarded the train, he announced, "I am Inspector Harnett of the Metropolitan Police. I must request all the gentlemen in the train to be present for identification in connection with a matter of the utmost seriousness." Initially, suspicion fell on Karl Vobe, who was arrested. However, during the identification, witnesses made a dramatic and unexpected identification, not of Vobe, but of Dr. Gottfried Hessel, the ship's chaplain. One witness whispered, "That's him, the tall one with the serious face. I would bet my life on him." The identification of a religious man as the potential murderer shocked both German and British society. Dr. Gottfried Hessel, a 31-year-old pastor born in Prussia and ordained in 1867, was now accused of the brutal murder on Christmas Eve. What is striking is the contrast between Hessel's reputation and the crime for which he was accused. As a respected clergyman, he represented everything that Victorian society valued: morality, education, and social status. That such a man was accused of murdering a fallen woman created a profound conflict in the social psyche of the time. On 29th of January, 1873, Dr. Gottfried Hessel appeared at Bow Street Magistrates' Court. The case against him rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. 5 of the 7 witnesses positively identified Hessel as the man seen with Harriet Buzzwell. The prosecutor argued, George Fleck, the grocer, categorically asserted that the defendant was the man who bought fruit with the deceased. William Stalker, a waiter at the Cavour restaurant, steadfastly maintained his statement that the defendant was the man he served dinner to. These statements, Your Honor, placed the defendant right in the company of the murdered woman on the night she died. However, Hessel provided a convincing defense, claiming that he had been bedridden with illness at the Kroll Hotel in America Square, London, on Christmas Eve. This defense was corroborated by several witnesses, including Karl Vobe, who testified that he had seen Hessel in the dining room at 8:30 p.m. on the 24th of December, noted that he was very ill, and prescribed him medication. The defense barrister, Mr. Straight, made a dramatic statement. The witnesses before you were photographed not by the aid of the sun or gaslight, but by a reward of $200. Their identifications were not colored by truth, but by greed. This dramatic statement, suggesting that the witnesses were motivated by substantial rewards rather than honest recollections, was met with applause in the courtroom. This reflects public skepticism about the case against the pastor. The fact that a large reward was offered may have created an incentive for witnesses to give false testimony, a problem that the judicial system of the time had no effective way of addressing. Evidence against Hessel included the statements from Jane Summers, a housekeeper at the Royal Hotel in Ramsgate, who claimed that when Hessel returned from London after Christmas, he asked Turpentine to clean his clothes and sent heavily bloodied handkerchiefs to the laundry. However, this evidence was ultimately deemed insufficient. Judge James Vaughan stated, "After considering the evidence presented, I find it insufficient to commit the defendant to trial. Dr. Gottfried Hessel is hereby discharged without suspicion." On January 29, 1873, Hessel was released. The case against him had collapsed. Hessel's release was reported by the Morning Post on the 31st of January, 1873, and public opinion swung dramatically in his favor. A public subscription raised an astonishing £1,225 for Dr. Hessel, including $30 from Queen Victoria. He even received a letter of apology from Prime Minister Gladstone. This public reaction reveals an interesting aspect of Victorian society: the willingness to defend someone of high social status when they are unfairly accused. It also reflects the contrast in how society treats different people based on their social status. The case seemed closed, at least for Dr. Hessel, but the true identity of Harriet Buzzwell's killer remained obscure. After Hessel's release, an anonymous letter from Germany revealed aspects of his personality that contradicted his venerable image, claiming that he had been expelled from his congregation for drinking and debt. The revelations came too late to affect the legal proceedings, but they cast a shadow over the flood of public sympathy. This raises an interesting question: was Hessel truly innocent, or was the evidence simply insufficient to convict him? The truth may never be known, but later revelations suggest that his public image may not have been quite what it appeared. Meanwhile, the investigation into Harriet Buzzwell's murder has stalled. Without modern forensic techniques, the Metropolitan Police have exhausted their leads. The identity of the killer seems destined to become one of the unsolved mysteries of Victorian London, at least until modern research uncovers a startling theory. The police chief said, "The investigation remains open, although I acknowledge our avenues of inquiry have narrowed considerably. We will continue to pursue any legitimate information that may bring Ms. Buzzwell's killer to justice." For nearly 150 years, the brutal Christmas murder of Harriet Buzzwell has remained a mystery, a footnote in the annals of Victorian crime. But recent research has uncovered a compelling theory that connects the murder to events that took place thousands of miles away from London. In 2019, researcher Stanley Bruce proposed a theory connecting Harriet Buzzwell's murder to a man named Wilhelm Krauss, a German who checked into the British ship Rifleman under the alias William Cross just 2 days after Harriet Buzzwell's murder. The timeline he uncovered has notable implications. 25th of December, 1872. Harriet Buzzwell is murdered in London. 28th of December, 1872. The ship Rifleman leaves London for Sydney with Wilhelm Krauss, alias William Cross, as crewman. This time alone arouses certain suspicion. A German man hastily leaves England in the immediate aftermath of a murder committed by a German-speaking assailant. Bruce's theory was based not only on the timing, but also on a deeper analysis of Wilhelm Krauss's personality and behavior. The German's sudden decision to go to sea immediately after the murder, his use of an alias, and his subsequent violent behavior painted a disturbing picture of the possibility that he was the killer the police had been looking for. But the Wilhelm Krauss story is just beginning, and will soon add a bloody sequel to the Harriet Buzzwell tragedy. What is remarkable is that this research was carried out nearly 150 years after the case, showing that even the oldest mysteries can be solved with modern research methods and international access to information. On 16th March 1873, less than 3 months after the murder of Harriet Buzzwell, and while the ship Rifleman was at sea bound for Australia, Wilhelm Krauss committed another brutal crime, the murder of Captain James Rush Longmuir on board. The circumstances revealed Krauss's violent tendencies and cunning character. Before killing the captain, Krauss attempted to poison the entire crew by mixing narcotics into the food and wine in the cabin. The judge at his trial would later describe a cunningly devised plan to gain possession of the ship, noting 7 other ropes were found that same night ready in your hand. In your private pantry, the pistols and daggers found on you the long iron bolt with which you attacked the chief officer. This level of violence and careful preparation shows that Krauss was not a spontaneous killer, but a planned and dangerous criminal. His attempt to poison the entire crew shows a level of ruthlessness and calculation that can only be found in serial killers. The judge in Sydney pronounced the sentence, Wilhelm Krauss, you are convicted of the murder of Captain James Rush Longmuir. You will be taken from this place to where you came from, and then to a place of execution, and there hanged until you are dead. And may God have mercy on your soul. On 1st July, 1873, Wilhelm Krauss was hanged at Darlinghurst Jail for the murder of Captain Longmuir, just over 6 months after the murder of Harriet Buzzwell in London. If Bruce's theory was correct, Harriet Buzzwell's killer would have faced justice, albeit for another crime committed thousands of miles away from the scene of his first murder. What is noteworthy is the similarity in modus operandi between the 2 murders. Both show premeditation, the use of extreme violence, and an effort to conceal the crime. This strengthens the credibility of the theory that the same person committed both crimes. Bruce suggested that toothmark evidence from an apple found at the murder scene of Harriet Buzzwell could be compared to Krauss's dental records, as he had been buried in Australia after his execution. Unfortunately, this forensic comparison was never carried out, leaving the theory compelling but unconfirmed. The Harriet Buzzwell case is not only a crime mystery, but also a window into Victorian society, with all its contradictions and injustices. Harriet's story highlights the vulnerable position of working-class women in Victorian England, especially those who, like Harriet, existed in the precarious space between respectability and obscurity. As both a stage performer and occasional prostitute, she lived in a world where violence against fallen women was often met with public indifference. The Harriet Buzzwell case demonstrates how class, gender, and notions of respectability influenced both police investigations and public responses to violent crime. A modern historian notes, the outpouring of support for Dr. Hessel, a respected expert, contrasted sharply with the limited public interest in Harriet Buzzwell herself. This contrast reflected deep-seated prejudices in Victorian society about the value of human life based on social status. If Stanley Bruce's theory, linking Wilhelm Krauss to the Harriet Buzzwell murder, is correct, the case represents a remarkable historical connection between a Christmas murder in London and a murder on a train a few months later. The fact that this connection has remained undiscovered for nearly 150 years speaks to both the limitations of Victorian-era international police communication and the enduring mystery of unsolved crimes throughout history. For Harriet Buzzwell, stage performer, mother, and murder victim justice may have been served indirectly through Krauss's execution, though her name remains officially among London's unsolved murders. Her story deserves to be remembered not just as a sensational crime, but as a reflection of the society in which she lived and died, a society whose shadows and injustices still affect our own. Today, Bloomsbury's Great Coram Street bears few outward traces of the bloody Christmas play of 1872. The Victorian world that shaped Harriet Buzzwell's life and death has long since disappeared. Gaslights have been replaced by electric lights. Horse-drawn buses have been replaced by cars. Yet the echoes of her story, revealing Victorian truths, still resonate through time. The murder of Harriet Buzzwell illuminates the challenges faced by working-class women of the era, especially those who had to navigate the thin line between social respectability and hidden dangers. The story also highlights the advances and limitations of the justice system of the time, as well as how social prejudice can interfere with the search for the truth. If the connection to Wilhelm Krauss proves to be true, it would be a remarkable example of how modern technology and research methods can solve old mysteries. It would also remind us that justice, though delayed, need not be denied altogether. Ultimately, Harriet Buzzwell's story is a reminder of the importance of remembering those who have been forgotten by history, especially women who have faced injustice and violence. In a world where we are still grappling with similar issues of gender inequality and violence against women, her story remains relevant and necessary. Christmas in London, 1872. While families across the capital celebrated the holy day, Harriet Buzzwell's life ended in violence. More than 150 years later, her story continues to fascinate and confound. A Victorian mystery whose ultimate solution may have been found not in the courts of London, but on the other side of the world beneath the gallows of a Sydney prison.